Alright, welcome back to another video of David's collection of VHS, DVDs, games, and more. Today I'm going to be doing my February 2022 DVD collection. Excited about this, I have 81 DVDs in my collection, including the Hit Entertainment DVDs. The DVDs I got rid of so far is that Simpsons Season 11 Disc 1 DVD. I forgot to do a video of this, a draw test video of this. It has problems with the episodes and issues, and it's useless. It's gonna be freaking epic. Now let's get on to the video. Starting off is the Wiggles Dance Party, which works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is the Wiggles Hoop-De-Doo is a Wiggly Party. This thing works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Thomas and his Friends Help Out, which works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Oswald Welcome to Big City. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. If this video gets to 14 minutes, it's going to be in 2 parts. Next up is Dora the Explorer Meet Diego. It works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Nicktoons Halloween, which works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Barney's Musical Scrapbook. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Thomas and his Friends. Thomas and his Friends Get Along. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Curious George Rides a Bike and Other Tales of Mischief. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Blues Room Snack Time Playdate. This thing works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Spongebob Squarepants Sponge for Hire. This thing works fine with no issues whatsoever, even though it's scratched. Next up is The Simpsons Complete Fourth season. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. I had to destroy my disc 3 disc because it doesn't work. Next up is the Nick Jr. Celebrate Spring Compilation DVD. If my camera will focus. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Blues Room. It's Hug Day. This thing works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Spongebob Squarepants. It's our favorites. This thing works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is 10 Years of Thomas and Friends. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Barney and Barney Songs. It works perfectly fine, but the Fragile Rocks parts mess up. Next up I have 2 Curious Georges on DVD. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Nick Picks Holiday, which works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Barnyard. It works perfectly fine, but it takes long for trailers. And the disc is scratched up, causing it to not work on my PlayStation. And the paper's in bad condition, and I had to take most of it off. Next up is Curious George Zoo Night and Other Animal Stories. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. I destroyed my other one because it has problems with the disc, having issues with trailers as well. Next up is the Best of the Super Mario Bros. Super Show. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is the ESPN Volume 3 Honor Roll College Basketball, which works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Curious George Rocket Ride and Other Adventures. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Thomas and Friends Percy's Ghostly Trick. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Thomas and Friends, Thomas's Trusty Friends. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Barney and You Could Be Anything, even though the front cover says Barney the Purple Dinosaur in it, even though the DVD disc says You Can Be Anything. So far, this disc works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up, I have 2 Curious George Plays in the Snow and Other Awesome Activities DVDs. They both work perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Curious George Takes a Vacation and Discovers New Things. It does work perfectly fine, except it is cracked. It does not have any issues whatsoever, though. Next up is Curious George Sails with Pirates and Other Curious Capers. This thing does work perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is SpongeBob SquarePants To Love a Patty. I apologize for the camera shaking. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Go Diego Go and The Great Dinosaur Rescue. This DVD works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Go Diego Go, Diego's Magical Missions. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Thomas and Friends, Calling All Engines. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Yo Gabba Gabba New Friends. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Wow Wow Wubsy and Wubsy's Egg Selling Easter. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Curious George Goes Green. This DVD works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Curious George, A Very Monkey Christmas. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Curious George Makes New Friends. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Curious George Goes to a Birthday Party. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Spongebob Squarepants, 10 Happiest Moments. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Thomas and Friends and Thomas and the Runaway Kite. It's in a blue case, and this thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Yo Gabba Gabba, Let's Visit the Doctor. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is America the Birth of Freedom with the Revolutionary War in it. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Curious George Plays Ball. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Curious George Gets a New Toy. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Curious George Bike Ride Adventures. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Curious George Saves the Day. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is my first ever Curious George DVD ever, Curious George Dance Party. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Spongebob Squarepants and these two box sets, first season and second season. They both work perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Jurassic Park Ultimate Trilogy. All the discs work fine except some have issues. Next up is the Blue's Clues Double Pack 2 DVDs in 1. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Doors Explore and Doors Butterfly Ball. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Curious George Swings into Spring. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Curious George in a Halloween Boo Fest. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Curious George in the complete 7th season. This thing works perfectly fine only on the PS2. Next up is Thomas and Friends and Thomas' Snowy Surprise. This thing does work perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Thomas and Friends Track Stars, which works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Hit Entertainment Awesome Adventures Volume 1 Rescue Friends. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is the Hit Entertainment compilation Winter DVD Frosty Friends. I know you can't see most of it, but it does work perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is the SpongeBob movie Sponge Out of Water. This thing works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Curious George 3 Back to the Jungle. This thing works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up I have 2 Blue's Clues Get Clued to School packs. This thing works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Spongebob Squarepants, The Adventures of Spongebob Squarepants, which works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Curious George in the complete first season. I only had 2 discs in there because disc 1 and 3 I destroyed because they have problems with the episodes. Discs 2 and 4 works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is these 3 Adventures of Curious George DVDs, which works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Fun with Friends, Outdoor Adventures, and Garden Discoveries. Next up is Good Burger, which works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is the Rugrats movie collection. The other one I destroyed because Rugrats movie didn't work and Rugrats Go Wild has full screen issues. Those 3 discs do work fine, but Rugrats Go Wild has full screen issues. Next up is Curious George Be My Valentine, which works fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is these 3 Pokemon movies. The game I play is Pokemon Go. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is the Blue's Clues Volume 2 Big Hits DVD. It does work perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is the Curious George 30 Stories 6 Hours of Fun. I do have disc 1 there, the old one I destroyed because of issues. It does work fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is the 2 Curious George 5 Hours of Fun Stories. It does work fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is the Nickelodeon Outlaw Vault DVD. Works fine with no issues whatsoever. And last but not least is the Blues Clues and You DVD, Blues Sing-Along Spectacular. It does work fine with no issues whatsoever. Now that's going to do with me with my February 2022 DVD collection. This is Davian's collection of VHS, DVDs, games, and more. Thank you for watching. I hope you like, subscribe, and comment. And I'll see you again in my next video.